jump. My background is in physics and mathematics and equations and formulae, but I just, about 6 or 7 years ago, became aware of the growth of alternative medicine. And I could see it in the local high street, I could see articles in newspapers about alternative therapies. And even though I didn't have a medical training, I had enough of a scientific understanding to know that these claims were exaggerated, sensationalist, distorted, even dangerous. And then two things happened. I think in around 2006, I heard of people going to homeopaths to protect themselves against malaria. So these were young students typically going overseas using a sugar pill, which is what homeopathy is, to protect themselves against a very serious condition. I couldn't believe this was true, so
at that point you knew homeopathy was just sugar pills?
Well, I knew that much. I mean, people may or may not be aware that a herbal medicine, okay, that's an interesting prospect. A herb is a complex cocktail of chemicals, and it may harm you, it may make you better. Herbal medicine is interesting. Homeopathy is dull. Homeopathy is so tedious because there is nothing there. There's no real debate to be had. And I couldn't believe that students would go and use homeopathy to protect themselves against malaria, and I couldn't believe homeopaths would be so irresponsible to help people in this way. So I asked a student to visit 10 homeopaths. She visited them, she said she was going to West Africa for 10 weeks, where they have strains of malaria that will kill within 3 days. And out of the 10 homeopaths, every single one, all 10 of them, said, here, take these sugar pills to protect you against a deadly disease. Everyone was willing to send them off unprotected. And that really worried me. So we did an investigation, it was on the BBC, it was in the newspapers, and I realised that the more you can reveal the truth, the more you can begin to inform people, the better judgments they can make. And at the same time, there was a BBC TV series, and I know you're involved in a TV series here in Norway, and your series is rationalist and scientific and has this enlightenment approach. The BBC series, and I love the BBC, I worked for the BBC for a long time, the BBC series was lacking in real evidence. Even though it was called Alternative Medicine, The Evidence, it was very unscientific, very, very misleading. The first time I ever submitted a formal complaint about the BBC, which was eventually upheld. And those two things, the homeopathy malaria scandal, the fact that even the BBC can be misleading, made me think that this is a subject that we have to get the facts out there. And I should stress that the book is very critical of a lot of alternative therapies. A lot of them just don't work, some of them are even dangerous, but the book is not anti-alternative.
Been around for very long.
Well, 200 years ago, you can argue about who invented the clinical trial, but 200 years ago there was a Scottish surgeon called James Lind, and he was worried about scurvy. So scurvy is when sailors go out to sea, they don't have citrus fruits, they don't have vitamin C, and their bodies literally rot, they decay from the inside. But 200 years ago, nobody knew what caused scurvy.
Sure, could I get that? No?
Okay. And more people were dying from scurvy than in battle or in shipwrecks. This was terrible. And James Lind said, well look, why don't we test different treatments? So they had 12 sailors, and he put the sailors in 6 pairs, and he put them in the same part of the ship, so there was good control for environment, gave them the same diet, so they had good control for nutrition, but then he gave one pair, and they had the same level of scurvy. He gave one pair salt water, because people thought that was a treatment. One pair had vinegar, one pair had lemon juice, one pair had cider, one pair had sulfuric acid, for some reason. And within a week, this lemon juice pair were recovering. And also the cider pair made some recovery, because cider is from apples, and apples have some vitamin C. But that's what you do, is you take groups of patients and you compare them. You give them different treatments, And that's how you move forward. But that was 200 years ago. It's only in the last 30 or 40 years that this really has become the fundamental of medical progress. There was a Welsh, I think he was Welsh, Archie Cochrane.
Yeah.
I actually know he died in Wales, but he lived, I think, in Scotland again. But he was a doctor, a medical researcher, and he said, look, you're doing a research study in Oslo, you're doing a research study in Australia, you're doing a research study in South Africa. Doctors can't read everything. So we must bring all of this information together and have an independent body, and it's now called the Cochrane Collaboration. And it's international, but it's a central body. And now they look at all of the evidence for vaccination, for homeopathy, for all sorts of interventions to see what the evidence tells them. Because at the end of the day, that's the most reliable thing we have is the evidence.
I think we use the Cochrane database a lot to make this program, Folkeopplysningen. And I don't think it illustrates or it's important because there's a lot of bad science out there as well. You can't just take one randomized controlled trial and draw any conclusions from that.
Yeah, you could. One clinical trial is utterly meaningless because there are the laws of chance. So, for example, in homeopathy, you could do a clinical trial on migraine, and you could get 100 patients with migraine and another 100 patients with migraine. This 100 you give them a homeopathic pill, and this group of 100 you give them a dummy pill. And after 1 month, you compare the two groups, and they're the same. Now, that doesn't mean homeopathy doesn't work, because that's one trial. It could be that the dosage was wrong. It could be that the condition wasn't quite severe enough. It could be that the effect is very small, that we couldn't see it. So one trial doesn't mean anything. But when in homeopathy, we have 200 clinical trials. And when you look at all of those 200 clinical trials, and focus particularly on the good ones. By good ones, I mean large studies, well-controlled, well-randomized. Then the evidence is still zero. Then you know homeopathy doesn't work. So one trial doesn't really tell you very much. One trial might say, oh, this is interesting. So, for example, there was an Australian doctor called Barry Marshall, and he was interested in stomach ulcers. And when I was a kid, people thought stomach ulcers were due to acid or stress or diet, and he, an antibiotic, took the antibiotic and cured himself. But that's one person, it doesn't mean anything. So he then did a clinical trial. He got a good result, but that doesn't mean anything. Other people replicated it. Okay, now it's looking interesting. Only when people replicated it in large studies did people accept his ideas, which at the time were absolutely shocking and outrageous and unbelievable. But I think that's one of the important things. It doesn't matter how crazy your idea is. If you can prove it with evidence, we'll put it in the book. You know, science is very, very open-minded if you back up your idea with evidence. So, I think Reiki is nonsense. I think reflexology is nonsense. The evidence doesn't stack up. But if somebody came to me with convincing evidence, we would change the book. In fact, we have changed the book. There was, in the copy you have, we're quite negative about the Alexander technique and back pain. When the next edition of the book came out, when the paperback came out, we changed that because new research came out which was more positive. And so we're now a bit more positive about Alexander technique.
I think that's a good example of how science works, or is at least supposed to work. And the example of the ulcers, I think that was in the 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe 90s, but not long ago.
Not long ago, and it started with one person getting this idea, and 20 years later he got a Nobel Prize, didn't he?
Yeah. And some people may say science is slow, but if science is any quicker, then you don't do the checks, you don't do the rigorous analysis, and you make mistakes, and when you make mistakes, patients are harmed. So you have to have this balance between being very open-minded, but only then accepting things when you can prove them with evidence. It's a difficult balance to have.
But science changing is also used as an argument against science, that what we believe in now, which doesn't have any supporting evidence, will be believed in just a couple of years. Just take Galileo or Semmelweis. They were all ridiculed, but soon thereafter they were heroes.
Yeah. So maverick. So you often hear alternative therapists who might be a kinesiologist. So with kinesiology, I think it's about the strength of the muscle. If somebody brings something that you're allergic to, then your muscles become weak, and that's a way of diagnosing patients. I would say this is rubbish. There's no evidence to show that it works. And the therapist might say, well, you know, there are energy fields that scientists don't know about, it's quantum mechanical, it's if you don't understand something, then just throw in quantum mechanics, that proves you must be right. And you know, maybe one day they will be right. I don't know. At the moment, the evidence says this is nonsense. And I think the two things to bear in mind are that 99% of mavericks turn out to be wrong. That's just the way life is. Only 1%, I'm making the numbers up, but you know, the maverick who turns out to be right is very special, very rare. That's why we remember Galileo. And secondly, if I replace kinesiologists with big pharmaceutical company, and the big pharmaceutical company says, hey, we want to sell you this drug, we don't have any evidence that it works, but one day in the future we'll show you how it works, we would say, get out of here. We wouldn't take them seriously. But there seems to be a double standard. The big pharmaceutical companies want to make a profit, and we have to keep an eye on them, because otherwise they may sell us products that aren't effective. But we have to keep an eye on them. Similarly, we have to keep an eye on alternative therapists, because I think the majority of them are kind people.
Read this book is, we're not talking a lot about science, but I think what makes this book is how fun it is to read, how many anecdotes there are, which keeps the reader very interested.
Thank you. I mean, I just should stress that if an alternative therapist comes to me and says, I had this amazing patient who recovered after I treated them, I would say that's just an anecdote, I'm not interested. My anecdotes are good anecdotes. No, if hopefully, I think the way we use anecdotes is we say, here is some scientific research, and the scientific research shows that this is likely to be true, and here is an anecdote that sort of shows that as well. So the anecdote comes after the evidence, rather than coming before the evidence.
One of these anecdotes that I remember very fondly is the anecdote of George Washington getting treatment. And as far as I remember, you think that this might have led to his death.
Yeah, but he was treated by what we would call a conventional doctor. So George Washington was suffering from some condition, seemed to have a swelling of the throat, and the standard treatment 200 years ago was bleeding, because there was some blood poisoning or something that had to be released, or pressure had to be released, or heat had to be released, but you bleed the patient either by cutting them or by putting leeches on them. And one of the things they did with leeches, if they really wanted to get a lot of blood out, is that they would cut the tail off the leech, so the leech just keeps on drinking and never gets full. And they bled Washington once, they bled him again in the middle of the night, they bled him again in the morning, and I think they removed over 2 pints of blood. And they thought they were helping him. But in fact, they were draining the lifeblood from him, and he died the following day from a condition he may well have recovered from. And the point of that story is that doctors 200 years ago thought they were doing the right thing, but they were wrong. Bleeding was harming patients, but they would remember those patients that recovered. They would forget those patients that died. If somebody said to them, this doesn't work, they would point to their professor who bled. If people argued with their professor, they would point to the ancient Greeks. But it was only when somebody said, we need to test bleeding, that the truth came out. And the same story. You get 100 patients here with pneumonia in France, 100 patients here with pneumonia in France. You bleed these patients, you don't bleed these patients do better than those, therefore bleeding's harmful. So a very, very simple approach, but incredibly powerful. And without it, doctors do more harm than good.
Yeah. I think, and that's around the time when homeopathy, where you focus a lot of attention in the book, actually arose.
Yeah, so Samuel Hahnemann in Germany could see that bleeding was harmful. He could see that mercury was terrible. He could see that arsenic was a poison. So he said he wanted to invent something new. And this is what he invented. These are homeopathic pills. And I think these might be caffeine. And his idea was that if caffeine keeps you awake, then a tiny little bit of caffeine can help you sleep. And when I say tiny, I mean you take a caffeine in a cup of water, you mix it up, you take one drop of this, put it in a cup of water, mix it up, take a drop of this, put it in another drop of... You keep on diluting and diluting and diluting until the final cup of water has no caffeine in it. It's pure water. But Hahnemann believed it had a memory of caffeine in it, or the energy of caffeine. And then you dip your sugar pills in this water and you energize or potentize them. And he believed this was the way forward. Now he was half right, because the old medicine was doing more harm than good. And so people in his hospital did well. Now they didn't do well because of these pills, they did well because they weren't being bled or given mercury. But now we want to know, well, we've got rid of the bad stuff, what good stuff can we give people? And we have a whole range of medicines, a whole range of medical interventions which are tested, which are sufficiently safe, which have more benefit than harm. Whereas these still are literally just sugar pills. I mean, I can take one of these, and these are supposed to make me go to sleep. I can take 1, 2, 3, 4. I can take all of these, and you will fall asleep before I fall asleep, I promise you. This is just sugar.
I read someone actually had a very good experience with that. They took, I think, about 70 of those pills, and 16 hours later, they fell asleep.
Wow.
So I rest my case. You are wrong. But you, homeopathy is an easy therapy to be critical towards. But you mentioned also in this book you have 4 main categories. You have homeopathy, acupuncture, chiropractic treatments, and herbal medicine. Why do you pick those 4 main categories?
I think just because they're popular. In England, certainly there's acupuncture on every high street, herbal medicine in every pharmacy. We have 3,000 chiropractors, so these are popular, they're widespread, and also they're different. So chiropractic is a manipulative therapy, it's hands-on, and it's state-regulated. So the public would say, well, if it's state-regulated, how can it be alternative? So we talk about that in the book. Acupuncture comes from a completely different place. It has a different philosophy. The evidence is mixed. I know you did a program about acupuncture, and there's evidence that it might work for nausea and pain. I think my interpretation of the evidence is that it's so borderline that it's 0. And if it is positive, it's so minorly positive that it's not really worthwhile. That's my interpretation. It's more interesting than homeopathy. And herbal is a tradition. Again, it's widespread. I'm sure there's a Scandinavian herbal folklore, and there are some herbs that seem to be effective, and others that aren't. And half of our pharmaceuticals, I think, are based on herbal products. So that's an interesting relationship as well. So they're all popular, they're all widespread, but they give us a bit of variety, I think, in terms of talking about alternative therapies. We look at all of the others as well, but more briefly.
We don't have too much time, so I wanted to talk a little bit about something that happened not long after you wrote this book. I have a picture here. You wrote an article in The Guardian with the title "Beware the Spinal Trap."
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, journalists don't write headlines. No. This is the thing. Somebody else writes the headline, so I don't know if I'd have written that headline, but...
And you wrote a paragraph saying this and concluded that the Chiropractic Association happily promotes bogus treatments. And something happened after you wrote this article.
I was sued for libel, and people that are worse than us are people like Singapore. It is horribly, horribly unfair. And they're so one-sided in England. We have a situation known as libel tourism, where people from outside England will sue other people in London in order to shut them up, because they know they will win in England. So we had, I think it was an Icelandic bank sued a Danish newspaper in England. An American company sued a Danish radiographer in England. A Ukrainian oligarch sued a Ukrainian newspaper in England. It's ridiculous. And so when I was sued, I knew I was going to have a big problem. Because even if I'm right, and I thought I was right, it would be an uphill struggle. And the problem is that the other side can stretch the meaning of your words. So, to start with, we thought it was about evidence. I say there's not a jot of evidence. And I stand by that. There's no good evidence whatsoever that chiropractors, spinal manipulation, how can they help children with colic? But maybe they have one case, or 3 case reports, or a badly conducted trial, or an uncontrolled trial. All of that to me is not evidence. But if they can persuade a judge, then I'm in trouble. And then you put in bold the word happily. And what does happily mean? Does it mean innocently, blithely, thoughtlessly, deliberately, knowingly? They said I was calling them a fraud. And I said, earlier on, for example, I call them fundamentalist in their beliefs. Now, people who are fundamentalists are not frauds. They're the opposite of frauds. They're the most honest people you can have. They may be wrong, but they're honest. But you end up with long arguments over the meanings of little words. And the case went on for 2 years.
Yes.
And for a long time it looked like I would lose. But luckily, at the end of the day, we persuaded, we had to go to appeal. We got the most powerful judges in the country. And they agreed with me, but more importantly, they said that we should be free to criticise medical treatments. A friend of mine, Peter Wilmshurst, was being sued by an American big medical company. And the judge said, look, whether it's a big medical company or whether it's alternative therapists, we must be able to criticise these people and debate the evidence, because that's how, as a society, we move forward. And the laws of libel are now being changed. Yeah. There's a new defamation bill being drafted. In fact, on Wednesday it finished going through the House of Commons, and it's now going to the House of Lords. And I think within 6 months we'll have a better libel law in England, something that is more akin to what I understand you have in Norway and in the rest of the civilized world.
2 years you spent on this case. How much did that cost you?
Had I lost the case, I would have lost £500,000. I won, if you win, you still lose money because you never recover all of your costs.
Oh.
And I think I lost £93,000 for winning, for being right. Now, luckily, my lawyers and some other people helped me out, and that's now I'm down to £13,000 out of pocket. But out of those 2 years, I lost the whole year's work. So in a way, that was the biggest loss financially. I became a father. My wife became pregnant during that life. It's incredibly stressful. It's the kind of thing that destroys relationships and so on. But it meant that in the Court of Appeal, my wife was there very pregnant, rubbing her pregnant belly, trying to get the sympathy of the judge. I think it made a big difference, of course.
But so now things are changing. I know your case did get some headlines here in Norway as well, some features in the newspapers, and I think it's just an example of how these rules should not be. We need the freedom of the speech, or it's a threat to the freedom of the speech.
Well, in Norway, that reaction was very important because it embarrassed the British politicians.
Yeah.
They could see what was happening in Norway, in Australia. In America, President Obama, 2 years ago, said, if you're an American and you get sued in London for libel, we will have no respect. You will not have to pay any bills.
No.
So when your ally, and a man you respect, tells you that your law is shameful, then again you have to change. So that international pressure was very important.
It's just a horrific case, I think. It really stood out.
Yeah, but luckily good things have come from it.
Yeah.
Hopefully they will in the next few months.
I have, how much time do we have left? 5 minutes. Okay. I think you wanted to see if there's any questions out there?
Yeah, and particularly if we have any alternative therapists. I'm really keen to hear anybody's views or questions or thoughts.
Do we have a microphone that can go?
Du kan bare gjenta det. Hva sier han til folk som sier at ja, men det hjalp meg?
Yeah, it's picking up an argument. It helped me. How can you argue against that?
If somebody says it helped me, it depends. Next question. It depends. So, for example, there was a study done in Bristol Homeopathic Hospital, where I think they monitored 50,000 patients for 5 years. And 83% of those patients reported a benefit. And you see homeopaths will talk about this all the time. 83% of patients, 5,000, 5 years. But we have no idea what caused those people to get better, whether it was their own body, whether it was other treatments, whether it was time. So we test it in a more controlled way, and it doesn't work. So for example, in colic, for example, one of the pieces of evidence that the chiropractors put forward was they had children with colic. So this is when children just cry relentlessly for days or weeks. And 100 babies went to see a chiropractor, and 93% of them improved over the course of 6 weeks. Now, colic always comes to an end. You know, we're not crying still today. Babies grow up. And so that's a meaningless study. But every one of those parents would have sworn that helped their baby. But they did another study where 100 babies went to a chiropractor with colic, but another 100 babies just went into a room and the nurse just held them for half an hour and then gave them back. And the parents didn't know whether their baby went to the chiropractor or the nurse, and they couldn't tell the difference. There was no difference in the group. So it works for me as it's hard to argue with people with personal experience. And to some extent, it doesn't really matter with colds or flus or insomnia tablets and so on. But when it comes to vaccinations, malaria, more serious conditions, nearly every time I give a talk in England, nearly every time, a doctor comes up to me afterwards, or even raises it in the Q&A and says, I have a patient with a very, very serious condition, and they're not seeing me anymore because they're seeing an alternative therapist, and I'll probably never see that patient again because without conventional treatment, they're not going to survive. So there's a spectrum of severity. This is not ridiculous, except it's irrational and pseudoscientific. Once you start moving beyond this, it becomes potentially very dangerous.
Spørsmål? Since there are no questions, I'm sitting here and I have a lot of questions. I just wanted to know, how do you think we can educate the public in this domain?
I think in England, in Britain in the last 10 years, we're beginning to see a shift against alternative therapies. And I think you have to do it in many different ways. So for example, there are people who take overdoses of these pills. They take literally 100 pills, and they do it on the street in front of the pharmacists. And that's a good stunt, because it just makes people realise that this is not a herbal medicine. This is just sugar. And if you want to use it, fine. If you want to pay 10 euros, fine. But it's just sugar. So that's one way. Another way is submitting complaints to regulators. People started complaining about chiropractors because they were suing me. Other people started complaining about them. And within a year, within 1 month, they stopped claiming colic and ear infections and asthma because the regulators stopped them doing that. And we need to be more vocal and more critical about using the regulation, the advertising standards, the trading standards. Another thing that happened was a group of academics, doctors, wrote to the health authorities in the UK. And they said to the health authorities, for every €1,000,000 you spend on homeopathy, that's €1,000,000 that you do not spend on nurses, on surgery, on counselling. So can you justify this? And I think the government spending has halved because of that one letter. So in many different ways we can alert people to these issues. And at the same time, we haven't spoken about what works. But part of that process is saying, well, actually, if you have digestive problems, irritable bowel problems, then hypnotherapy might work. If you have anxiety issues, then meditation may be helpful for you. If you suffer from mild depression, then St. John's wort might help you. As a herb, St. John's wort is very complicated and has lots of chemicals in it and can be dangerous, so you need to be very careful how you take it, especially because it can interact with other drugs you might be taking. But it's about getting the right information out there, because if we don't get the right information out there, or work with the regulators, then misinformation just spreads. And it's fantastic that the series that you're involved with is being critical and speaking out in defence of science, and in favour of the benefit of the patient. Whereas the BBC programme that initially got me angry was really just not being scientific at all. It was pretending to be scientific. So.
And I think it's so nice to finally have a book that I know is great to point to when people ask me about books in Norwegian. So we're out of time, sadly. I'll hope you'll be back and that you'll write more books. I know you're talking about, or you're involved in a new book right now.
Yes, I'm writing a book about the Simpsons.
About Simpsons, that's great.
They've got 6 writers who are PhD mathematicians.
Yeah.
And they embed a lot of mathematics in their series. And so I'm going to meet them